quite a few studies earlier this year published, as for example, one by KfW, the German Development Bank, taking a more conceptual view and qualitative view at social protection for a just transition. It seemed important to us to also empirically highlight the potential of social protection in achieving a just transition. And to the best of our knowledge, there was no cross-regional study, including low-income and middle-income countries doing that. So this study attempts to address this gap, although by no means exhaustive. And the study also followed the guiding objective of the G7 activities in 2022 under the German presidency. That was under the motto of progress towards an equitable world. And so it also aims to inform options or avenues to achieve this. And obviously with social protection not just being a policy mechanism for redistributing resources, but also beyond that playing a role in promoting sustainability, economic stability, transformation, health, social solidarity, and basically an investment in a better future. And so what the study does not aim to achieve, and I think this is important, it was not the intention or expectation for the study to provide concrete recommendations for the countries considered, for which the granularity of the analysis would not have been sufficient, but rather to illustrate the mechanisms of the interplay between climate policy and social protection instruments or programs across and also beyond these different countries that the study looked at. And so with that, just to say a few more words about the, first of all, the lead author of the study, Dr. Katrin Gazio, who will be presenting the findings of the study today. She's a senior research fellow at SASPRI, also a research affiliate at the Center for Microsimulation and Policy Analysis, University of Essex, among others, and her work focuses on comparative social policy research using tax benefit microsimulation models. And just to say, there are a few other people from SASPRI also involved. First of all, Professor Gemma Wright, who I think is with us today as well, co-executive director of SASPRI, David McLennan, who's a director and senior research fellow, and Professor Michael Noble, also co-executive director and senior research fellow. And then from LSE, we had Dr. Xavier Jara, research officer, and then also Daniele, who has already been introduced, who also was involved in another study. So hopefully he can also later on in his comments contextualize a little bit and link the two studies as well. So with that, I would hand over to Katrin for the presentation, and hopefully it'll work with the slides. If you can just try and click to see. There we go. Over to you, Katrin.
Thank you, Christina. I'm very happy to be here today. So thanks for joining this ad hoc meeting in the middle of summer. I'm gonna briefly introduce to you the study and our results, and I'm happy to receive comments afterwards, and really looking forward to your feedback, actually. So I guess I'm preaching to the choir here when I say that it's increasingly recognized that in order to achieve sustainable development goals, the transformation to a carbon neutral economy needs to be coupled with support to those in societies that might be potentially affected and vulnerable to certain measures. And this is especially the case in developing and emerging economies because they face a bigger challenge. They already have a high poverty risk today, and they need to fight poverty, and at the same time they need to transition to a carbon neutral economy. So social protection plays a very important role in this context because it can help to cushion the often the new risks of climate change and climate mitigation policy, and also the existing vulnerabilities. We all know that there are core functions of social protection, like reducing poverty and vulnerability and protect from immediate impacts of shocks. And when I say shocks, it's often implied that we mean these classic shocks like unemployment and so on. However, in the context of climate change and managing climate risks, there are also very specific roles of the social protection system in order to facilitate a just transition. One is to cushion adverse impacts of climate change and climate policies. The second one is to incentivize sustainable and carbon neutral decisions. And the third one is to focus on skill development and green jobs. Today and in our research, we actually focused solely on the first function of facilitating a just transition, and specifically we focus on the adverse impact of climate mitigation policies and how these can be cushioned by the social protection system. So the objective of our study is to demonstrate how social protection can alleviate or even avoid the adverse socio-economic effects of climate change mitigation policies, especially on vulnerable people and people that already today are living in poverty. And we are doing this by showing how revenues generated through these climate change mitigation policies can be used to cushion the effects by redistributing the generated revenues back through the social protection systems. So the project aim is to empirically assess the potential of social protection for a just transition in developing and emerging economies. And here is a short overview of our project. We are focusing on 6 low middle income countries. Those are Indonesia and Vietnam, Ecuador, South Africa, Tanzania, and Zambia. So we have quite a diverse collection of countries here with very different starting points when it comes to their carbon footprint in the country, as well as when it comes to the poverty situation and the extent the social protection system is already developed in these countries. We are focusing on 2 climate change mitigation policies that have a direct impact on the consumption and income situation of households. The first one is carbon pricing, where we simulate 3 different scenarios ranging from 20 to 50 to 80 US dollar per ton CO2. And we are also simulating removal of fuel and electricity subsidies in a selection of countries. However, today I'm going to focus on carbon pricing due to time constraints. And then, of course, a very important step of our analysis is to model 3 potential social assistance reforms where we use the revenues generated by, for example, carbon pricing, and we improve or at least change the existing social assistance benefits in the countries. We model 3 different reforms. One is the generosity scenario, where we increase the amount of the benefit that people receive. So we stick to the same recipients as to the same people that already receive a benefit today, but we increase the amount that they receive. The second one is the coverage scenario, where we actually extend the number of people that are receiving support, and we only increase the benefit amount a little bit. And the third one is where we keep the social protection system completely as it is today, but we add an additional unconditional benefit that goes to everyone, to every child, to every old-aged person, and to individuals of working age with a disability. So we build on the existing systems in the country. So to that extent, the reforms are different in each country, but we always follow the same aims and characteristics in each country. And then we assess outcome measures. The main focus today is on poverty income impact using the extreme poverty line. But in the report, we also show income consumption changes, and we also take behavioral effects of carbon pricing into account. Again, there is unfortunately not enough time today to go into details of all these results. And I've mentioned already a couple of times that we are simulating reforms, we are simulating carbon pricing, we are simulating reforms to the social protection system, and we are using tax benefit microsimulations models for this. So we are using INDOMOD for Indonesia, SA-MOD for South Africa. Both of them have been developed by SASPRI, by my colleagues. And for the sub-Saharan African countries, Ecuador and Vietnam, we are using the SouthMod models. They are developed by some of the co-authors together with national teams in different countries. And it's a project that is coordinated and funded by UNU Wider in Helsinki. So before I'm presenting the results, I just want to show you the starting point in each of the countries. And we need to take into account two things. One is the existing social protection system, and the other one is the carbon footprint in each of the countries. So when it comes to the state of social protection in the selected countries, there are social assistance benefits that are targeted at poor households in all the countries in focus. However, the efficiency and the coverage differs widely across countries. There's very low coverage in Tanzania and Zambia, and it's highest in South Africa. Then we also have different levels of extreme poverty. Extreme poverty is very high in Tanzania and Zambia. And unfortunately, the current social protection system does very little to reduce poverty through social protection. And inequality is very high across the countries, but it is often reduced by the current system. Again, Tanzania is one of the countries where there is the least impact compared to South Africa, where we see the most impact in inequality reducing effects by the current system. Then there is, of course, the second side of the medal, which are social insurance benefits, and they exist, they are quite limited. They often only concern a small share of formal employees, while informality is quite common in these countries, and especially in sub-Saharan countries, the share of the formal workforce is comparably low. And this is, among others, a reason why we are focusing on social assistance benefit reforms in our simulations. Then when we look at the second part of the starting point for our analysis, the carbon footprints, we see that the carbon footprints varies largely across the countries, but also income and consumption groups. We see that the light violet bars show the average footprint in the country. And we see it's highest in South Africa, followed by Ecuador, Indonesia, Vietnam, and very small carbon footprints in Tanzania and Zambia. And then when we look at the quintile-specific footprints, we see that often for the fifth quintile, the footprint is substantially higher than for all the other groups. And this leads to different starting points of revenues that can be generated through carbon pricing. So once we introduce carbon pricing, and here I'm showing you the revenues for the $50 scenario of carbon pricing, we see that we increase revenues. Here it's in percent of GDP. The revenue is highest in Ecuador and South Africa, and it's really quite small for Tanzania and Zambia. So this is the revenue that we can now redistribute into the social protection system. But before doing that, let's move first to the result of carbon pricing. What's the impact of carbon pricing on the poverty situation in the country? So the graph that I'm going to show you next is where we simulate the carbon pricing, but not yet the social assistance reforms. So what you see here is the change in percentage points of poverty headcount for each of the three scenarios of carbon pricing. We see that there is actually quite some difference across the countries and also across the scenarios. Of course, the more you charge for your carbon footprint, the higher the poverty impact. It's really small for Vietnam. because Vietnam is a country where the number of people in extreme poverty, but also the number of people close to the extreme poverty line is quite small. So a very small number of people now move below the poverty line after we've introduced carbon pricing. We also see that it's comparably low in Zambia and Tanzania, as well as Indonesia, while it's quite pronounced in South Africa. Yeah. So now we use the revenues that we have generated through our carbon pricing, which has led to an increase in poverty levels across all the countries, but impacts are smaller to larger depending on the country context. And we're now using these revenues to simulate our social assistance reforms. So in the next graph, I'm showing you the impact of carbon pricing, now focusing on the middle scenario, the $50 only. And on top of it, we also simulate our social assistance reforms. The first one that focuses on improved generosity, the second one that focuses on improved coverage, and the third one that introduces an unconditional grant for children, working age, individuals with disability, and older age groups. And this is the result. Again, I'm showing you the poverty headcount and how it changes when we introduce carbon pricing plus the new social protection reforms. The dark purple bar is already familiar to us from the last graph. We've seen that the impact of carbon pricing differs across countries. And now when we use the revenues to redistribute it again into the social protection system, we see that actually for 4 out of 6 countries, there is successful not cushioning of the increased poverty risk, but in addition, we not only cushion the poverty risk, but we actually decrease the poverty levels in the countries. This is the case for Ecuador, Indonesia, South Africa, and Vietnam. So this means if the revenues generated through carbon prices would completely redistributed into the social protection system, then the poverty situation in all these 4 countries would go down. So it would be lower than it is today. And this is the case for all 3 social protection reforms. While if we then go to Tanzania and Zambia, the 2 countries that actually have the highest extreme poverty rates across the 6 countries, but on top of it have very low carbon footprint and very low revenues generated through carbon pricing, we see that actually the revenues that are generated are often not sufficient to cushion the impact or to, on top of it, improve the poverty situation of the country. So in Tanzania, we see that actually there is hardly any, there is no cushioning effect for the generosity scenario and the coverage scenario. Very small effect for the categorical benefit because poverty levels are so high, even if you provide an unconditional benefit to a large group of the population, you still target a very large share of the poor population. That's why you see an impact here. In Zambia, the situation is a little bit better. Zambia has quite a good social assistance scheme, the social cash transfer. And so when we increase the generosity, poverty goes down. When we improve coverage, we see that at least the negative impact is cushioned. And again, we see a very small effect for the categorical benefit. So there is some improvement, but it's very, very little. In most other countries, we see that actually the generosity reform is quite successful in improving the poverty situation in the countries. And this is while the coverage scenario is less successful because it provides a smaller benefit top-up than the generosity scenario, and thus doesn't lift as many people above the poverty line than this is the case for the generosity scenario. And in South Africa specifically, we also find quite a substantial effect for the categorical benefit, and that is due to the current social protection system. Already today, South Africa provides grants to children, older people, and disabled. At the moment, there is an income test, but the income test is quite high. So once we get rid of the income test, more people receive the categorical benefit and they receive an additional amount. And that's why there is this quite substantial decrease in poverty in South Africa. What I should also say is that even though we don't see much going on here in Tanzania and Zambia, our reforms still improve the poverty gap. So even though the reform is not sufficient and not substantial enough in terms of benefit amount to push people above the extreme poverty line, at least more people move closer to the poverty line. So there is some success in these reforms. So, and with this, let me sum up our results and give some policy recommendations. Well, the key findings are that policy interventions such as carbon pricing and the removal of subsidies can have a significant negative impact on households. And this is especially the case in countries where climate-friendly energy sources are scarce and behavioral change is difficult. We see that in Ecuador, South Africa, and Vietnam, introducing carbon pricing would disproportionately disadvantage people in lower income groups. However, we can also show that using the revenues can help to improve the poverty situation in many of these countries. The best social protection reform scenario depends significantly on the country context. We need to take into account the carbon footprint, how much revenue can be generated, the existing social protection system, and the poverty situation of the country. So here I'm listing the three dimensions again, just to emphasize again that the context, the country context really matters. So what we see when it comes to the carbon footprint is that it predefines the potential level of revenue that can be generated through climate change mitigation policies, but it also predefines the potential effects of climate change mitigation policies on different groups. So depending how large the carbon footprint in different groups of the countries, that also kind of predefines the impact on poverty, their income situation, and so on. The second dimension is effectiveness of existing social protection system. And here I mean it in terms of generosity and coverage. What we've seen in our analysis is that both need to go hand in hand. It's not enough to provide, it's often not enough to provide very substantial benefit amounts if you don't cover the right amount of people in the country. And the effectiveness of the existing social protection system also predetermines the additional investment that countries need to make to lift people out of poverty. What we see in our analysis is that the shortcomings of the existing systems are very often amplified when introducing climate change mitigation policies. Thus, knowing your current system, the extent it covers people in need, the extent the programs are generous enough, is important to understand to what extent climate change mitigation policy is going to impact on the situation of households. And the final dimension is existing poverty situations, because especially in countries with high poverty levels, the potential for significant poverty reduction is lower, because often the revenue generated by carbon pricing is often too little compared to what is needed to reform existing social protection systems and to actually also decrease poverty levels in the countries. So let me finish with some broad policy recommendations. We think that considering social protection as key policy area to complement climate change mitigation is very important in order to achieve a just transition. So social protection policies need to be an inherent part of just transition packages and also thought through from the beginning of implementing just transition packages. And this is hopefully also enable politicians to come up with more ambitious climate action while also sustaining public support for it. Secondly, we want to highlight again that understanding workings and limitations of existing social protection systems is very, very crucial in order to effectively mitigate negative socio-economic impacts of climate change policies. You need to know your system, you need to know the shortcomings of the system in order to implement the reforms that are needed for households and vulnerable groups of the country. So it's really important to consider the country context in terms of poverty situation, fiscal space, and capacity of existing social protection system. And finally, I just want to emphasize also that it's important to consider options at the global level, because what we've seen, especially in the case of Tanzania, is that it's a country with a very low carbon footprint. So introducing carbon pricing is probably not the main priority. At the same time, it's a country that already today feels the climate change, feels the impact of climate change. And so in order to improve the poverty situation and in order to also help people that are hit by climate change, it would be important to get some international support. And with this, I'm at the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Katrine. I wonder if there are, maybe we move into question answers shortly before we also invite our discussants to share some thoughts. But that was very relevant. I think what you said in the end, that it depends on the country context. I like how the findings show that in some countries it's a pertinent reform choice, whereas in other countries it may not be the option. And we often say like social protection is not the silver bullet in every case. So it's good that that it shows that very clearly. I'm sorry, there are some dogs barking just under my window. I hope that's not disturbing you. I have one question, but I just wanted to open the floor for questions from the group first before I present mine. Are there any questions? Okay, Anna has put a question in the chat. Can the team explain why they only looked at subsidy reform in 3 countries?
Yes, the main reason is that it was sometimes very difficult to find information on the existing fuel and electricity subsidies in the countries. So we focused on those countries where we could find reliable information, unfortunately. So it's really practical reasons.
Thanks, Katrine. Anybody else has a question? Maybe I can just ask. I was thinking that how much, like you said, that the micro simulation models were developed for 2 of them developed by Saspri itself and another one with your local partners. How much of this is also usable for other contexts? For example, if other practitioners or researchers would want to do similar studies for their context, I wonder if the methodology and the model itself can be shared and can be used by other practitioners.
Yeah, thanks. It's a very good point. So the South Node models, they are all freely available and open access through the UNU wider website. You can also contact me and I can guide you through the right website. IndoMod is unfortunately not open access, but if you're interested in research for South Africa, you can contact us and we can provide access to the model. On top of that, all the models are developed on a common platform. It's called Euromod. It's a software that was specifically developed for such models in the European context. So all such models exist for all EU countries and are also freely available through the European Commission website. And the software is also available and quite user-friendly. So if you're interested in building a model for your own country, it might take some time and a steep learning curve, but it's definitely doable. There is also all kinds of training material out there. So yeah, it's really we are really trying to build our work on open access models and data sets as much as possible. If you have more specific questions on this, please just get in touch and I'm happy to help.
Thanks, Katrine. I think that's good enough for now. We will open up the session for more questions later. I think we have two discussants who can just give their thoughts and related to their study as well. So we'll directly go to Daniel first to share your thoughts and tell us a little bit of how the study relates to also your earlier study. And then I will give the floor to Anna after Daniel. Thanks. Over to you, Daniel.
I actually feel bad because I thought Anna was going first, but I'll do this against gentleman rule, but I will start then. Yeah, so good afternoon also from my side, and thanks for the presentation. I was also part of the study, and I think it was a very interesting process. And I may have maybe 5 points that I would like to add that I want to add just not to repeat the points that were already made. So I think, in general, I think it's, of course, as you said also before, I think I'm already speaking to the converted. And I think this is a very important topic, as there was, for example, a recent meta-analysis showing that among all determinants of people's acceptability of climate policies, the distributional fairness is the most important factor. So even more than the climate effectiveness of the policies, people really seem to put a lot of importance on the distributional fairness. So of course, looking at what happens to poverty and inequality is the #1 factor in why people support or not climate policies. If I now come to the study, I think there are some points that really, I think, are clear and also clear also from sort of other research. And I want to start with the issue of budgets. So this was maybe not discussed in terms of numerical terms in the presentation, but the report basically says that $50 per ton carbon tax, for example, could raise revenue more or less around 1% of GDP, which is a huge sum considering the low level of emissions, and also a huge sum considering how few many low and middle income countries spend in social protection. So even a tax on low emissions can really kind of raise a lot of budget relative of what is already spent in social protection. And I think this is also has many relevant implications at the international level, because with a global carbon tax, also in the context of global climate clubs, really revenue for low and middle income countries can be significant if we have international redistribution. So I think this is a very important point. Now, a second important point, which actually I think it's a crucial one, which I also discuss a lot with more climate-related people or with climate-related research, is that really the report shows how important it is to properly simulate different designs of social protection. So basically, the point that I want to emphasize here is that most climate change research, they do simulate, for example, at the global level, sometimes at a national level, what is the effect of recycling revenue from a carbon tax. But in 99% of the cases, what they do is they use lump sum per capita, so equal per capita transfers. And this is, I find, very limiting, because as we saw from the study now, a different design of social protection or redistributions, first of all, change a lot the results. And second of all, it's actually more realistic because many countries cannot actually do per capita lump sum transfers because they cannot target many of the people. So the second point is that it's really important what the study shows, that different designs of social protection can have very different results. A third point I would have is that, I mean, it was already said that the context really matters a lot. And I think I just want to highlight two other sub-points about this. First of all is that context matters a lot also because of the carbon intensity of different sectors. So South Africa carbon footprints, for example, here were very high because of the energy sector. But for example, research shows that, for example, India's carbon footprints are quite high because of the food sector production. So having also more contextual analysis can also lead us to have very different or like more tailored climate policies that would make the effects even more progressive. And also in terms of the context matters, I think it's also important in terms of methods. So in this case, for example, we used a top-down approach, which was sort of inspired by the work of Chancel, but many others use it. But also the different methods can also lead us to very different results. And so this is an important point. And the last point I want to make is that I think what we also tried to do in the report, and I think it comes out also from the presentation, is to really make policy messages quite easy to grasp, because one of the main issues with the acceptability of climate policies, but in general of looking at the socio-ecological policies where you have effects on the environment and effects on the social outcomes, it's very difficult to communicate to people exactly what are the final outcomes of such complex policy design and policy mixes. And so I really think that what the report does, and what I think we should aim at increasing even more, is to kind of communicate much better such results. And just to give an example, we're doing a lot of research on what do people prefer in terms of recycling revenues from carbon taxes. And most people answer recycling environmental projects. And the reason is not that they evaluate more the environment compared to the social policy, but they don't realize, first of all, what is the impact of a carbon tax that has emission reduction impacts, even though the revenue is not recycled to environmental purposes, just because of the effect of the tax. And second of all, they don't realize how much they would gain, or most people, especially in low part of the income distribution, would gain actually from revenue redistribution. So my last point is about making policy messages much clearer and showing that it can be not a trade-off, but a complementarity between environmental and social outcomes. And I think I'll leave it to here, but very happy to discuss later about also more methodological issue if there are some questions.
Thanks, Daniel. That was comprehensive, and given that we had attended your earlier webinar, it's also a good refresher and nice to see the connections. Anna, maybe over to you now for some comments and also reflections.
Lovely, thank you very much. Yes, thank you for this invitation. And in fact, I've got 5 points too, and they overlap somewhat with Daniela's, but I think they complement them. I mean, first of all, I think I'm just really delighted to see this study. It's so useful to have this kind of empirical information for us to base our work on. So thank you very much for that. Yeah, I mean, I think my first point is just to re-emphasize the importance of the fact that the impacts on poverty and on inequality are so dependent on the nature of any particular economy. And I think that point is really well made in this report and very clearly illustrated. And I think the critical thing is not just to look at the aggregate impact on poverty, but to break it down in the way that these colleagues have across the poverty distribution. And I think what's interesting is that really each country will be significantly different because it depends on the consumption patterns. And these kind of fuel price interventions, they act not only through the fuel price directly, but the major impact on the poor are through things like the cost of public transport and the cost of food. And so impacts will really vary depending on the extent to which people consume these these commodities which are reliant on fuel. So, for example, if you've got a more agricultural economy, which is based on subsistence inputs, the impact may be less than where people are actually having to purchase their food. So I think that point about the variety of impacts across different countries is really well taken. And I think it reinforces the point that you need to actually look at each country on a case-by-case basis. So I think that's really the first point, which I think came out very clearly in this study, and it's really important for us all. The second point is that I think that comes out really clearly from this study is the really potentially important role of cash transfers in compensating for these kind of impacts. And I think Danielle alluded to this, but it seems to be really important that these kind of cash transfer compensation programs are phased very closely with the implementation of carbon pricing initiatives. And I think this lesson has come out over the last few decades, because there have been a number of energy subsidy reform activities which took place over the last 10 or so years, not due to responding to climate objectives, but due to sort of austerity measures and fiscal restructuring. And the clear lesson that comes out is that if you don't have these kind of measures in place at the time that you introduce the reforms and the carbon pricing, you're very likely to have significant resistance from populations. I mean, just last year, I think there were riots in Angola and Senegal when these kind of fuel subsidy prices were reduced. And I think we've got colleagues here from Nigeria. I mean, in 2012, they had to abandon the reform process, the subsidy reform process, because of there weren't complementary measures to protect the poorest at the time. So I think this policy coherence between your climate change mitigation policies and your social protection policy is really critical, and there needs to be joint planning and policy coherence, bringing together those different sectors. So when the just transition is being planned, there needs to be that joint planning, and I think that comes out very clearly. But the other issue which comes out was really stark, I think, in this report. The impact of the cash transfers in Zambia and Tanzania were really muted because of the limitations of the social protection systems themselves. And to me, this is perhaps the most important insight from the study. It's that actually, if you have a poor or embryonic social protection system with low coverage, low value transfers, actually it may not be a very efficient vehicle for compensating for carbon pricing interventions. And so, I mean, here the questions are, is there a comprehensive registry? Is everybody included in that registry? Can the distribution systems reach people who are affected? And so where actually your social protection system isn't very effective, its capacity to respond and compensate for the impacts of carbon pricing are really quite muted. And so in that instance, you have to think about what other measures might be. And so I think it's just useful to mention that other ways of looking at this are perhaps introducing fuel subsidies which are targeting the fuel used by the rich rather than poorer segments of the population, such as aviation fuel. So there's a question about the design of your CCM policies and how they could be introduced in a way that's pro-poor or phased in some kind of way. But if you're looking at compensatory measures, one option is to look at poverty-targeted subsidy, other kinds of poverty-targeted subsidies, for example, food subsidies. But then again, this is problematic because if you have a poor registry in the first place, it's difficult to actually target alternative social protection measures. So then perhaps you're looking at things like subsidizing the foods that poorer people consume, or subsidizing the fuels, maintaining a subsidy for the fuels that poorer people use, or even introducing things like variable tariffs. I mean, I think in Rwanda and China, they introduced variable fuel tariffs so that low consumption is charged at a much lower rate than those who consume more. So I think it's necessary to look beyond cash transfers at what range of different interventions could be put in place. And if you look beyond direct social protection, it might be that education subsidies or health subsidies would help to compensate for the impact in terms of the consumption basket, or even looking more broadly, subsidies on things like public transport. So it's necessary to look at what can be achieved through cash transfers, assess the limitations, and then look at what other kind of interventions could come into place. And then I had one final point, which relates to the financing issue, which is in fact that whatever the redistributive implications of introducing these kind of carbon pricing measures, there's going to be competition nationally for use of those resources. And we all know that often the social protection ministries are those with very limited negotiating power and bargaining power. So I think we need to factor that into our discussions when we're thinking about this. And it may be that actually domestic resources can't be fully mobilized, that the domestic gains from carbon pricing can't be directly recycled into social policy provision. So then I think we get to the importance of issues raised by Daniela in terms of things like global carbon taxes, i.e. non-national taxes, which could perhaps be mobilized in favor of compensation. So yeah, I think those are the points that I wanted to make, and yes, most of them are mentioned in the paper that Cecilia Costella and I prepared, which I think was mentioned in the link. But yeah, be happy to discuss further. And thank you, and congratulations on an excellent paper.
Super. Thanks, Anna. And thanks, Daniela, for those points. I think it's really important what you just mentioned, that there's where it is not possible, where social protection is still nascent and is not an option to be compensating, there might be some other reform choices. And this is important to also look at the country context and discuss these choices based on that. And when it's still not adequate, then it's also important for the international community to see what can be done about that. Thanks for raising those. I think the floor is now open for any questions, comments on everything that has been said so far. And also maybe the other authors present here, maybe if you want to take a floor, add anything or share any insight from the other side, which was not mentioned, like the carbon pricing. So if there's something that you want to share first, maybe the authors, and then the floor is open to anybody who wants to unmute and ask a question to the discussants as well as the authors.
Perhaps shall I say a quick word? I don't know, Javier, if you would like to as well, but thank you so much to Daniela and Anna for your really helpful responses to our paper. We found it such a positive experience to work in this collaboration, and also the number of avenues that we were that were opening up to us during the process of the analysis blossomed to such a point that it was quite an exercise to keep the main shape of the focus that we were able to retain, and to really appreciate the way in which you've responded to the things that we drew out. It also does demonstrate the potential for further work in this arena, because we just selected a small number of possible examples, of which there are many. And also, as Katrin and Sayanta highlighted, there are a growing number of models that use microsimulation models that use the Euromod software, and so it is possible for this work to expand. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot for the comments. I just wanted to highlight a point raised by Anna, which I think is really important, is the fact that this exercise has not only allowed us to, consider or link the discussion of climate change versus social protection, but also highlight perhaps the challenges already faced by by the design of social protection in some countries. So in fact, there might be issues of targeting, which independently of how you want to make use of the resources, will not allow you to target or to cover those affected by this type of policy. So in that sense, this raises the broader issue of design of social protection in low and middle income countries. So to which extent can we think about redesigning existing social protection policies in a way that we can encompass those more vulnerable, not only to economic shocks, but also to climate risks in some sense.
Stina, go ahead.
Just a quick comment on that one. I mean, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. It also shows the homework that we as the social protection community have to do. And I also think, I mean, just from the reactions that we got over the past few months from people regarding the study, just the expectation that there would eventually be policy recommendations for these countries, I think also shows us what work still needs to be done, right? Because I think that's essentially what we're pointing towards, but not necessarily doing with the study. And I mean, I do think that there are quite a few countries that are actually interested in receiving assistance specifically regarding this question. I mean, we know that the IMF is constantly getting requested to support countries in reforming their existing fossil fuel subsidies and asking about, how to actually best reform. And I do think that all of us, I mean, I see UNICEF, UNDP here in the room as well, will have to support countries in that endeavor going forward to also address a lot of the social protection related questions that will come. I also saw that there was a question in the chat, and I'm wondering because it says, if Nigeria colleagues could tell us a little about the removal of fossil fuel subsidies in the country where the discussions about channeling some of the resources to social protection are, or why did it not happen? Be super interested in that as well. So if there's someone who can say a few words about that, that'd be great.
Matthew, you want to take the floor and answer that?
No, not to answer that. Maybe while colleagues from Nigeria collect their thoughts, if they are able to contribute. I suppose I was just, I know the focus on this was on the carbon pricing, but there were a limited number of countries for the fuel reform or electricity subsidy reform. I was just interested specifically, I know Zambia was one of those with the electricity subsidy reform in the study, and given the kind of findings on carbon pricing, I was wondering what the findings were in relation to subsidy reform in Zambia specifically, since that was a sort of trickier context in terms of addressing those adverse effects of the mitigation policies there. So I'd just be interested to hear your findings, and I guess that links a little bit to the question to the colleagues from Nigeria.
Shall I respond immediately? Yeah. So in Zambia, the way it works is that there is a national provider for energy, and the price is more or less fixed by the government. However, they don't produce enough energy for the whole country, so they need to buy in more resources from private companies at a higher price. So basically, that's what we assume to be the subsidy in the country, and we see very similar effects actually for the removal of the subsidy. However, effects are often a bit lower because unfortunately we can only take into account the direct effect, while we cannot, for the removal of subsidy, take into account indirect effects, like, for example, maybe food production would be more expensive or public transport would become more expensive. So that's why we see generally, we see a lower effect of the removing the subsidy than for the carbon pricing, but that's because the way the carbon footprint is calculated, it already takes into account also these indirect effects. Maybe some experience from Indonesia. They are really heavily subsidizing fuel in the country, and already for many years they are trying to get rid of this subsidy, but it's very complicated because there is a lot of resistance, and then it became even more complicated in the recent years because of inflation, because of the global effects of the war in Ukraine. So that just shows how difficult it actually is to get rid of such measures. And very often, I think the population is also not aware how much money, how much revenues are actually spent on these type of measures. And very often, these measures are considered as social protection measures, even though they are actually benefiting the whole population, and very often the higher income groups more than the lower income groups more. So I think maybe here as well, more communication to the population when governments are trying to get rid of such measures would be very important.
Perhaps just one quick follow-on from that is that, okay, so you've spoken to the kind of aggressive nature of those subsidies in terms of who they benefit, but did you also separately model the redistribution of those subsidies into, through your three approaches? And did it, in, say, the Zambian context, look at all different from the ways in which carbon pricing redistribution would kind of impact, or was it broadly the same kind of conclusions?
It's broadly the same conclusions, because in countries like Zambia, people at the bottom of the distribution have a very small carbon footprint and also use very little fuel. They often don't have a car. They energy. They often don't have lights and so on in their houses. So both climate mitigation policies actually are more likely to hit the higher income groups more than the bottom, and both only generate a small amount of revenue. So in both cases, the revenue was not sufficient to achieve a higher, or to achieve a substantial reduction in poverty. But we modeled both measures separately, and the results are in the report.
Thanks, Katrine, and thanks, Anna, for sharing all these notes in the chat and links. I think this is helpful for others who are also joining the conversation. I was thinking, like this point made earlier, that you have this climate change mitigation policies being discussed and done at a different agency at the government level than the social protection agencies. So I wonder how much of, even if there's a carbon pricing introduced, how much do we see in reality? And this is not directly part of the study, I can understand, but how much do we see that this money will go into social protection? Isn't this a natural tendency for policymakers in the climate change adaptation agencies or ministries dealing with natural environment to invest in environment adaptation, nature-based solution type of projects directly, instead of thinking that we should channel this through social protection? As Christina said, there's homework to be done here, but is this something that we see a direct relation already being made, that we need to channel this money being made through social protection reforms?
I know very little about how much of the revenue would go directly to the countries. Maybe others know more, but I think there is a clear message to international organizations to advocate for including social protection measures into their just transition packages. So I guess that would be the message from our study. For me, it's very difficult to judge how much of the revenues would actually end up in social protection.
I mean, if I can add a point linked to this, I think the report shows, or like other studies show, the other hand of the scale. Because if you look now at global carbon pricing revenues, just 5% is given to households. So it's a very small quantity of revenues now given to households. And I mean, this is partly because the EU ETS, for example, leaves social policy in the hands of the national countries and not the EU. So the EU cannot really decide how to use the revenues, but also if you look at other countries, it's mainly distributed to environmental projects or to general budgets. So this is, I think, is a very pertinent, relevant question that I think also these studies that show what's the distribution implications, I think, can help to sort of at least give some more revenues towards social protection. And then if I can make another point on Nigeria, so I'm not 100% an expert on Nigeria, but I read a recent study showing that basically was arguing that further subsidy reforms in Nigeria are basically hindered back by what I think is another point that needs to be addressed a bit better, which is the link between social protection and trust in the government, because many climate policies are very much blocked because of low trust in the government. And I always wonder whether social protection can be also used in a better way to increase citizens' trust in the government. I don't know whether that because of more visible programs that people can feel that they are part of, or in other ways, but I don't know whether people here have some views of it on how to increase the effect of social protection on trust that then would also increase the possibility of governments to implement climate policies.
Thanks, Daniela. Anna, yes, go ahead.
Daniela, I think this is really a key issue, and it's UNRIST is really pushing these ideas at the moment with their work on the new eco-social contract, which includes considering how social protection is necessary in order to take this whole eco-social contract forward and the just transition. And I think it's also something which is, it's really central. I mean, we've seen in Europe that the removal of various subsidies has led in part to the emergence of the right so powerfully politically. And I think there's a very strong link between subsidy reform, social protection, and sort of political unrest and political transition. And I think perhaps this is one of the reasons that it could be an argument for supporting increased social protection provision, because it's clearly an enabler of CCM policies. In the absence of some kind of compensation, we've seen time and again the emergence of unrest and the abandonment of policies. So I think we need to present social protection as a key enabler of effective CCM policy delivery and acceptability. And then in the context where there aren't domestic resources for this, I think that's a basis for an argument that for the mobilization of international resources. Because it seems clear that in so many instances, CCM policies will not be able to be implemented successfully in the absence of some kind of compensatory interventions. And they have to be very visibly compensatory as well. I mean, it's not just the introduction of the policies. As you say, Daniela, they have to be perceived to be just. They have to be perceived to be compensating for the adverse impacts. So yeah, I think it's a key issue, both practically and conceptually.
Thanks, Anna. I think also Mariam has written in the chat how the difference between what the fuel subsidy removal does and the hardship it places on the people of Nigeria is not what social protection could match up and compensate. So it's also important then to think about the design itself and what complementary support services might be necessary for the context and the scale of compensation needed in those cases. So thanks. Una, do you want to, you also have put a comment in the chat. Did you want to mention that?
Yeah, no, I just was wanted to say it might be good. The discussions on carbon pricing at the various climate change conferences are often very, you know, technical, and they're hard to follow, and it's, you know, certain lines in the UNFCCC. So I think this is fantastic. The study is fantastic, and it's great because it's not oversimplifying the effects, you know, it's kind of contextualizing it. And I think it just might be good to, I don't know, try and include it more in our discussions on social protection in a kind of easing in way. And maybe locate some materials on that explain carbon pricing in a not too technical way to complement this, because I know people get lost and they turn off when it comes to Article 6, is it? And, you know, okay, that's up to the climate scientists or up to the micro simulators or, you know, the economists. So I just think that would be a really good idea, because it's fantastic, and it does make sense based on, you know, the comments from everybody about the just transition and about the timing of both at the same time, you know, of when they're introduced, and the communication to the public as well. I think those points are important. Over, thanks.
I just wonder, just to flag up and think through, obviously the work that we're doing at the moment around nationally determined contributions as well, and NDCs, and, you know, we've talked about, so for those of you who haven't been involved in that discussion, which has been part of this wider group, you know, we're providing advice to governments as they develop their nationally determined contributions that are due out next year, and thinking about the role of social protection in relation to all aspects of climate action. And I think, you know, this session, these reports, these studies are helpful for our thinking in terms of how we communicate that, both in the kind of brief that we're preparing, where there's not going to be too much room to go into massive amounts of detail, but then also we can kind of do when we work with governments going forward to address the kind of issues that Uma, you know, is raising there as well. Christina, you've got a point.
Yeah, sure. Just to add, and maybe also, Shianti, to your earlier question, how much of it is actually then going to be channeled through social protection systems? I think it's quite interesting actually to look at some countries who've already done it, right? Like I think Switzerland is one of them. I think there it's about 2/3 of the money that is available that is going to be, or is currently being redistributed, which I think is quite a significant amount. I think in Canada, it's sort of up to the provinces. I think the money is then channeled back to the provinces. And Daniela, you're nodding. I think you might know this a bit better. But I think there then sort of depends on the regional level governments, how it's actually being redistributed or to what extent. I think a really interesting case, because we were talking about communication, is actually Austria, because I think potentially even more so than in Canada, where people just happen to find the money in their bank accounts one day. I think the Austrians have been a little bit better in actually communicating that there is a climate bonus, I think is what they call it, and who actually is eligible and why it's also linked to carbon pricing in that respect. And I think that is actually quite an interesting case also for us to consider, you know, what to do and what not to do, and to also make it clear that there is almost a right to some extent, if you take money away at some point or another, that it should also be redistributed. I think remains to be seen how that could work in other countries, but I do think we have more examples than we think we do. So maybe that's an additional homework to look at these as well. Anna, was that directly related to my comment?
Yeah, no, it's directly related to that. I mean, it's really interesting to hear about these ways that the revenue has been directly transferred back to people. I mean, the other way to approach it, the sort of opposite end, is to look at it from a fiscal revenue tax regime kind of perspective. I mean, you could actually look at changing your tax incidence and reducing VAT if you wanted to target the kind of redistribution to the poorest. You know, there are these other kind of instruments as well. So there's actually giving people money directly, or there's revising the taxation system. So I think both of these ends of the spectrum are really interesting to look at as alternative ways of approaching this issue. Although obviously reducing VAT isn't always so visible, so it may not bring you the same kind of political dividend and social dividend, but it's another interesting option. Thanks, Christina. Are those ideas, those experiences written up anywhere that you know about? Because they'd be really nice to know more about.
Good question. When I was at the ILO, we were working on a paper, so potentially there might be one coming out soon. I'm not sure. But I think, yeah, there are quite a few. Also, the national governments have actually documented it to some extent on their respective websites. And I know for Canada, there are quite a few studies as well. Daniela, I don't know if you know of any additional sources.
I'm putting on the chat a paper that shows, for example, how people in Austria and Switzerland were actually not even aware that they were getting recycling there. So if you give me 30 seconds, I'll put the paper in the chat.
Sounds good, thanks. Yeah, and then I just had one additional point to add to what Matthew was saying in terms of, I mean, we now have this window when governments actually have to update their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions until next year. And we were just talking to the NDC partnership that actually collects requests from different countries and then also tries to find partners that could support countries in actually dealing with these requests and addressing them, helping them develop their NDCs. And there are quite a few that relate to, I mean, A, carbon pricing, but also B, redistribution, looking at what they call social pillars in some countries, how to strengthen those in the NDCs. And so I think that is a little bit of a window right now to, I mean, on the one hand, alert also social protection counterparts in the countries that this is currently happening and that the commitments and the goals for the coming years are being defined or updated, but then also how one could actually address some of these questions around redistributive policies and social protection specifically. And so I think that's yeah, I think the clock is ticking right now.
Thanks, Christian. I think it's also homework for all those of us working directly with some of these country counterparts and government agencies influencing or trying in some ways to influence the NDC updates upcoming, to keep that in mind as we help and support the governments doing this work. There is a comment from Connected Edges in the chat, which is quite interesting, that the just transition has been, the component on just transition has been mainstreamed into the National Social Protection Policy with support from ILO Nigeria. Would you like to share something a little bit more on what do you mean by it has been mainstreamed and what has been included? That might be also very nice for us to understand. It's also okay if you are unable to unmute yourself and want to put it in the chat. But thanks for sharing that. We can also look into it. Are there any? We are almost 2:20 now, and we already thought in the beginning that maybe it's going to be 1 hour and then half an hour optional. But we have kind of gone into bigger discussions, which is always great. No, but are there any last comments, thoughts, things that you want to share or raise?
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, I've been having difficulty with my network. Basically, I just want to use this opportunity. I don't know whether you can hear me.
We can, yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Okwemi. I'm from Connected Edges Africa. We work on climate change to make the planet habitable for both human and animals. And I've been part of the development in Nigeria to ensure that just transition, which talks about taking practical steps into climate change issue in Nigeria. And thank God and want to appreciate the federal government of Nigeria at the national, subnational, and the local government. ILO did something unique in Nigeria, and they ensure that all the MDAs, that's ministry, department, and agencies in Nigeria and civil society were brought together for a week-long intensive workshop, and they review and revise the National Social Protection Policy, in which the people, the key stakeholders, were able to mainstream just transition perfectly into the policy. So I don't know whether you can get in touch with ILO focal person for climate change in Nigeria, in person of Mr. Dr. Aguga Stephen, who was also invited to be part of this meeting today, for him to give more updates on what ILO in Nigeria has actually done. Kudos to ILO Nigeria, kudos to the federal government of Nigeria, kudos to all the members of civil society in Nigeria and Africa in general. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think thanks for sharing that. We can definitely look into it. It's also one of the things that we as a working group want to do, have more country experiences shared on how we are or how your countries are mainstreaming these in social protection. And and we have Yana from ILO, who is also co-chairing this working group with us. So for sure, we can look into it. And if there's a possibility to organize some another ad hoc technical meeting on that, on how the process went, how did you get all the stakeholders in place, and what actually happened in terms of mainstreaming this, we would definitely look into that. So thanks for sharing. Yeah, are there any other comments or thoughts before we close the meeting for today?
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Stephen.
Okay, my name is Stephen Agugwa, the project coordinator for ILO Just Transition Program in Nigeria. So I didn't join the meeting in time, apologies, but I heard most of the thing, and I will be glad, to participate in further meeting, maybe to share more experience on what ILO have done in Nigeria regarding to just transition. Just like the former speaker said, we have been able to create more awareness on just transition because it's just a new term in terms of developing countries. So we're able to give some training, upgrade the capacity of institutions, government, labor organization, and workers organization, employers organization. So we have been able to do some activities. And at the moment, we're also doing some program with the waste management sector, where we are trying to organize, put more a bit of decent work in the sector by formal.
Stephen, you got muted. Sorry. We don't
Hello,
hear
can
you.
you still hear me? Yeah.
Yes, now.
Okay. Yeah. Glad to share more information in your future programs. Yeah.
Sounds good. Thanks, Stephen. Yes, for sure. We will be in touch and see if we can organize something also to learn more about your process. With that,
Yeah.
I think we have 5 minutes left, and we also see people dropping off. If there aren't any other big comments, I just wanted to take the moment to thank all the authors who were kind enough to come today and present the study. It was great hearing, and I think it's important that we create these numbers and empirical evidence to drive the policy discourse. So thanks for sharing this, and thanks for giving us the opportunity to actually have this meeting. And we will upload the recording from today into our socialprotection.org website on climate change and social protection, the USP 2030 working group. I'll also make sure that all the documents shared in the chat are also available for you all to have a look at on our website. Thanks for joining today and have a great rest of the afternoon. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
So thanks to our presenters and discussants. And
Thank
thanks, Shanti,
you.
for moderating.
Thanks. Bye.
Discussion.
Thank you.
And
Thank
enjoy your
you.
summer
Thank you.
break.
Thank you.
I enjoy.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Mariam. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.